Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Arcadia Ballroom here at the Higgins Hotel. I'm Jeremy Collins, the Senior Director of Programs at the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. It's great to have you all here. It's great to have our speakers here bright and early. We had to give these guys the 9 a.m. panel instead of the 8 a.m. panel yesterday. I know you were, John. We're going to carry on with the theme that we've sort of been touching on with how the ending of the war really saw a ratcheting up of desperation and violence. And we've got two folks who you've heard from already and one that we are honored to have here with us. Mark Stille served our nation honorably as a U.S. Navy intelligence officer and then continued in that line of work as a senior intel officer for more than 2 decades. He's here to talk about one of his newest books, but he has so many books that they're all new and it's hard to keep up. He'll be speaking on Leyte Gulf, but he just released a great book on the Battle of Midway, which leads me to our other speaker, John Parshall, who wrote, up until Mark's release, perhaps the best book on the Battle of Midway. We'll see. They'll duke it out.
Best book ever written.
Shattered Sword. They could be tied for first.
It was a good run.
Yeah, it's been around.
John has been near and dear to the museum for over a decade now, and he's one of our favorite speakers, one of your all's favorite speakers, and also a great featured tour historian on our overseas tours. And chairing them will be another John with an H, Curatola. Dr. Curatola is our Samuel Zemurray Stone Senior Historian here at the museum. John has, as I mentioned, 2 books under his belt about nuclear warfare, sort of post-war, but it goes back into the wartime as to how we were going to use this new weapon in the Cold War. But his 3rd book coming out in May is on how the Army learned how to do amphibious operations from North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and then, of course, D-Day, Normandy. So I'm pleased to announce that John's book will come out. We'll do an author event here on campus, but more importantly, when you sign up to come back for next year, John will be featured to give an overview of his work, Armies Afloat. John Curatola, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate that. Unlike my colleagues here, when I get a royalty check, I can put cheese in my cheeseburger. These gentlemen can invest their royalty checks.
Wish that were true.
I just realized this morning as we sat up here, we have an all-naval panel up here. You got a Marine, a naval officer, and a naval historian. So shout out to the sea services here. Yeah. But to kind of frame our discussion this morning, if you were here on our pre-conference, Colonel Fontenot brought up the idea of culture and how important that is in a war to understand your enemy and not be sympathetic, but to have empathy with your enemy and how they think. And what we're going to talk about here today is this application of kamikazes. And you're seeing this idea of a fundamental difference of how an Eastern mind, philosophy, cultures, and values differs from most of us in this room of a Western mindset, and these ideas of sacrifice and service to the emperor or to the state is fundamentally different from us in the West and how we see the world. And so I think today with our 2 speakers, we're going to learn a little bit about the Japanese mindset. If you remember before the war, for those of you who studied it, there's a cultural anthropologist by the name of Ruth Benedict who writes a book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword that gives insight into the Japanese mind so we can help understand our enemy better. And her best conclusion is this is a foe unlike we have ever faced before. And she kind of sets that tone in her work. And I think by looking at this particular application of kamikazes in that light, we can have a better appreciation of how the Japanese fought this war near the end. So with that, I will turn over to Mark.
Good morning. So it's day 3 now, and we are finally at the good stuff, kamikazes and Leyte Gulf. So it's a great way to start a Saturday morning. So
Start off with a bang.
literally, yeah. And they gave me 20 minutes to cover the world's largest and most complex naval battle, so we should probably get started. So, as you know, though, the Battle of Leyte Gulf isn't a kamikaze event per se, but it is, in essence, the first Japanese mass special attack operation. So, we're not going to go blow by blow through this battle. We're going to look at some of the key points in the battle and some of the most egregious myths that still surround the battle. And we got to have some background first. So here's the first and most important background slide. It shows the naval balance before the battle was fought. So if you look at the two forces there, you see a great disparity in strength between the Americans and the Japanese. The Americans bring this huge force to bear. There's two fleets in action here. They have a great superiority in air power. As you can see, there's over 40 American carriers in this battle, and they embark some 1,500 aircraft. Japanese have a mere 4 carriers, and they have a very weak land-based air force. But what the Japanese do have, though, is a relative parity in big gun ships, battleships, and heavy cruisers. So that's what they're going to try to leverage in this battle that we're going to talk about. Some more background here. I know you guys probably know who these people are, but we're going to talk about them briefly and how they fit into the battle. Nimitz is the commander of the Pacific Fleet, and it's his ships that fight this battle. But of note, though, not all the ships in the battle are under his authority. The most important command figure, though, for the Americans is Admiral Halsey, who we all know as the Bull, and he's the commander of the Third Fleet. Third Fleet is the most aggressive and most powerful naval force on the planet at this point. So everything he does is magnified in this battle. So a few words about Halsey. If you go over to the big museum across the street, they call Halsey impetuous. So I think that's a little bit harsh on the Bull, but maybe not much. But he certainly is a very aggressive commander, as we're going to see in this battle. Halsey likes to be both fleet commander and task force commander, so he overshadows Mark Mitcher during this battle. Mark Mitcher is commander of Task Force 38. Task Force 38 is where all the carriers in the Third Fleet are located. The last guy on the slide is Thomas Kincaid. He's the commander of 7th Fleet, and that's the second of the 2 U.S. fleets in the battle. And of note, he is not under the command of Nimitz. He's under the command of the Southwest Pacific Area Command, and that's under one Douglas MacArthur. So next slide talks about the Japanese, and we need to meet these people because each of these guys have an important role in the battle. The guy on top there, top right, that's Admiral Toyota, who is the commander of the combined fleet, and he's the guy that comes up with this plan to defend the Philippines in October 1944. And we're going to talk more about his plan in a couple of slides here. The most important command figure for the Japanese is Admiral Kurita. He's the stern-looking guy there in the lower right, and he's the commander of the 1st Diversionary Attack Force. And that's the key force in Toyota's plan here. So a few words about Kurita. He's not aggressive like Halsey. He's, in fact, a rather cautious man. He's by no means a coward. Don't think ill of him in that way. But if Toyota wants to fight this go-for-broke battle, he probably has the wrong person in place if Kurita is in charge of the major force in the battle. All right, here's the Show One plan to defend the Philippines. Show means that's Japanese for victory, and one is the variant to defend the Philippines. So this is Toyota's effort to repel the American invasion of the Philippines. And looking on that map there, we can see these forces in play. The one on the top right, coming down from Japan into the Philippine Sea, that's the Ozawa force. I don't think we mentioned Ozawa on the last slide. Unfortunately, he's the commander of the main body, and that is the Japanese carrier force in this battle. So the main body is coming down from Japan into the Philippine Sea, and he has the mission of luring Halsey away from Leyte Gulf. That gives the Kurita force, which is that force in the solid red, the chance to steam from the Singapore area all the way through the Cebuyan Sea, through the San Bernardino Strait, and then down Samar towards Leyte Gulf and get into Leyte Gulf from the north. Meanwhile, the Shima force and the Nishimura force are the two smaller forces, and they're going to come into Leyte Gulf through Surigao Strait, and they're going to come up from the south into Leyte Gulf. But we got to talk more about the show plan, because the show plan has a lot of problems, as we're going to talk about, but it does really dictate how the battle is going to be fought. So Toyota, he believes that it's critical to defend the Philippines, because in his view, it's a use or lose situation as far as the fleet is concerned, because if the Americans can take the Philippines, then they can cut off the slocks between the resource areas in the south and Japan proper. So that would cripple Japan's ability to continue the war. So he takes everything he has left in the combined fleet, and he comes up with this plan for a decisive battle. And this notion of a decisive battle is deep within Japanese DNA. They're going to try it again here in October 1944. But you saw that slide. There's no way the Japanese are going to win any kind of battle, given the balance of forces in play at this time. So we talked about the central role of the Kurita force, because the Kurita force is the force that's under orders to get into Leyte Gulf to destroy the American invasion fleet. That's the whole goal of Show 1, is to destroy the American invasion fleet before it can land the invasion force on Leyte. But to do that, though, you have to handle Third Fleet somehow. Toyota wants to do that the old-fashioned way. He wants to use land-based air power to do that, but he knows that's not going to work. So his backup plan is this decoy plan. And everybody fixates on this clever diversionary aspect to the Japanese plan. But I think we give them too much credit for this. The Japanese carrier force hadn't recovered from its beating in June 1944, the Battle of Philippine Sea, so there was nothing else they could do with it, really. And it's not like they sat down on a deep level and they thought, well, we know Halsey's in charge of Third Fleet. We know he's a very aggressive guy, and all we got to do is dangle some carriers out there and he'll go chase them. That's not how they were thinking. They were trying to use the carrier fleet they had left in the only way that they could. But to be fair, though, this plan pretty much did work as they had hoped. Problems with the plan, though, we saw that balance of forces on the first slide. Japanese are very weak on air forces. That makes the whole plan incredibly problematic. You saw that slide where Japanese have forces coming from all kind of different directions, long distances, and it's a very complex plan. Japanese Navy loves complex plans. And but here you're going to have excellent communications and coordination. And given the friction of war that always happens, that's not anything you can count on. But here's the real rub of this plan. The stated objective, is to defeat the American invasion on Leyte. The Americans land on Leyte on 20 October. And for various reasons, the Kurita force cannot get to Leyte before 25 October. So by that time, the invasion force is ashore, the invasion is a success, and the invasion fleet has sailed away. So this whole plan, in essence, is rather pointless. Okay, there are 4 major engagements in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The first one is the Battle of the Civilian Sea. So we're going to talk about that one first. This occurs on 24 October when the Kurita force is steaming through the Civilian Sea en route to Leyte Gulf. And Halsey reacts, and he brings Task Force 38 into play. But he's caught off balance for various reasons we really don't have time to go into right now, but it boils down to bad intelligence. And so he's only able to fly 252 sorties on the 24th of October. And that sounds like a lot, but it really isn't, because a couple days before, when he had the Third Fleet concentrated and he was attacking targets on Formosa, on 12 October, he was able to mount 1,400 sorties. So this is it's a major effort, but it just really isn't enough to turn back a force as large as Kurita. So they do have some success. They sink the super battleship Musashi. They send a heavy cruiser back to Singapore. But other than that, the Kurita force is pretty much intact, and it's headed still for Leyte Gulf. So that brings us to the first major decision in the battle. And everybody, I'm sure, has heard about this, and this is when Halsey decides what to do on the evening of the 24th for the next day. And this is when he takes his race to the north, as it's often phrased. So to understand this, we have to understand what Halsey knew at the time and what he assessed. So here we see what he knew. So it took Task Force 38 quite a while to locate this decoy force, but they finally did so in the afternoon, the 24th. But it's late in the afternoon, so there's no chance to launch a strike at that point. So Halsey's now trying to figure out what to do the next day. So he knows that there's an intact carrier force to his north. That's 4 carriers and 2 battleships up there. He knows that the Nishimura force, which is coming through Surigao Strait, is going to be handled by the 7th Fleet, so that threat will be neutralized. And he has been told by his aviators that the Kurita force has been badly mangled. So he thinks that is ineffective. The main force, the Kurita force, ineffective. So based on that, he assesses several important things. And the most important is that the Kurita force, if it does continue on to Leyte Gulf, that can be handled by the 7th Fleet. Meanwhile, there's an intact carrier force to his north, and throughout the entire war, the carrier force had always been the primary Japanese threat, and that's still the case in Halsey's mind here. He also thinks that it's unwise to divide Task Force 38 in the face of the enemy. So had they been a bit more nuanced, they could have maybe handled both threats at once, but that's not U.S. doctrine, and that's not the way Halsey is thinking. So there's a lot of factors that shape his decision. Unfortunately, we can't go into those at this time because of time. But the bottom line is that Halsey takes Task Force 38 in its entirety, and he goes north after the Japanese carrier force. He does not leave San Bernardino Strait guarded or even watched. So, but in my mind, I think this decision is preordained for the reasons that we see in that slide. And in my mind, because of what he knew at the time, I think it's actually the right decision. So that brings up the second battle we're going to touch upon, and that's the Battle off Samar, or as I call it, the misunderstood battle off Samar. So Kurita comes through the Sibuyan Sea. He enters the San Bernardino Strait. There's no one there. He steams through, and he heads south towards Leyte Gulf. And he runs into an American force, though, called Taffy 3. So this slide shows you the balance of forces for this battle off Samar. The Kurita force up top, it's a very powerful force still, and the not-so-powerful Taffy 3 with the ships that you see there on that slide. So the Battle off Samar is a battle unlike any other battle, which we're going to talk about a little bit, but both sides are surprised. So, but the Japanese never realize what they're facing. They think they've encountered part of 3rd Fleet. They don't realize that they're facing slow and unarmored escort carriers. So based on that, Kurita fights a very tentative battle. On the other hand, Sprague fights a very good battle. He launches all the aircraft he has right away. He leaves a lot of smoke. He uses his escorts to attack the Japanese. And that's the part of the battle people are most familiar with, is the brave attacks by the escorts against the Japanese battleships. But there's a lot more to the attack than that. During the period of the battle alone, the Americans had over 200 sorties from the escort carriers against the Japanese, the Kurita force. So that's a huge factor in this battle. So the Japanese begin this long-range gunnery duel against the escort carriers. They have some success. They hit 4 of the 6 carriers. They sink 1, but they never do converge and annihilate the Taffy 3. So after a while, after about 2 hours, Kurita calls off the action. He's not able to take care of this force. He does think he's achieved a major victory, though, but keep in mind that his mission is to go into Leyte Gulf. So he breaks off the attack after about 2 hours. So just a few more key thoughts about Battle off Samar. Battle of Samar is a battle unique in naval history. There's never been anything like it before or since. It's not a David and Goliath story of American destroyers against Japanese battleships. It's the largest air-sea battle in history. Like I said, there were over 200 American aircraft sorties during the battle. And several themes here emerged that had been themes throughout the war. And one is the primacy of aircraft over ships. So during this battle, American aircraft sink 3 Japanese heavy cruisers. Another thing that was in evidence was it's hard to sink ships with gunnery at long ranges. It's just hard. It's always been hard throughout the war. And that's in their very best of circumstances. And that these were not good circumstances for the Japanese off Samar. There's a lot of smoke in the area. Sprague uses weather skillfully. And don't forget, all this time the Japanese ships are under attack by aircraft and escorts, and it's hard to get a fire control solution when you're always maneuvering. So given the circumstances, the Japanese do sink 4 ships with gunfire, which really isn't that bad, all things considered. So at this point now we go to the second major decision in the battle, and that is Kurita's call whether or not to go into Leyte Gulf. So he breaks off the battle against Taffy 3 after about 2.5 hours. He reforms his ship. That takes him a while. And then he decides he's going to go into the Gulf. So he informs Toyota that I'm going to stay on mission. I'm going to be a little bit behind, but I'm headed into the Gulf. I'm headed that way. And then about a half hour later, he changes his mind, and he heads north away from Leyte Gulf. So under what situation would a Japanese admiral disobey orders like this? I mean, the whole goal of this massive operation is to get the Kurita force inside the Gulf, and now Kurita decides not to do that. Well, Kurita never really talks about this in detail after the war, so we don't know exactly what he's thinking, but we do know a couple of key things. As far as he knew, he was fighting the entire American Navy by himself. Critically, he had no communications with Ozawa. He did not know that Ozawa had drawn Third Fleet to the north. That'd be nice to know if you're trying to not deal with that huge force on your way into the Gulf. But he's also aware of a large number of American forces converging around him. So he fears if he goes into the Gulf, he'll be trapped in the Gulf. He'll never get outside of the Gulf. But the real reason is that he's not a convert to the Show One plan. The Show One plan is a desperate plan, and he does not sign up for a suicide attack. Even before the battle started, he saw a situation where he might have to decide whether to sacrifice his fleet for, as he called it, empty transports in the Gulf. And that's about really all there is in the Gulf. So given all that, I think he takes the brave decision to not sacrifice his men needlessly. And he breaks off the attack and heads back towards San Bernardino Strait. And here's the ironic part. He tells his boss what he's doing. He tells Toyota, I'm headed north, I'm breaking off the attack. And Toyota acquiesces to this. So even in the end, Toyota didn't believe in his own plan. He could have ordered Halsey, Kurita, to go into the Gulf and do what you can and shoot up everything in sight and die fighting, but he declines to do that. And the last slide is some takeaways, and we're right on time too, which is actually very surprising. So, so here's some takeaways. We're going to beat you over the head with these things we've already talked about. But the Show One plan, I mean, to me, that's the most enthralling part of the battle, is trying to figure out the Japanese mindset here. The Show One plan is not a serious plan for victory. It's a desperate plan. It's a reckless plan, and Toyota, he admits that. It's a gamble. In fact, like I said before, it's in essence, it's a massive special attack operation. And what it really is, and the Japanese planners admitted this to their army counterparts before the battle, what it really is, it's a fitting way for the combined fleet to meet its end, and a glorious, honor-laden death. So that's how they're thinking at this point. Third Fleet was badly handled. We talked about that. And it's not because Halsey took the fleet north. I think that's very defensible. given the situation, but it's because Halsey is never able to bring the full power of the world's most powerful fighting force, either against the Kurita force or the Ozawa force to the north. So the Third Fleet runs back and forth and doesn't have the impact on the battle it should. Samar is that misunderstood battle, and it's not an epic American, well, it is an epic American victory, that is true. But it's not that they were facing heavy odds and they should have been destroyed within minutes. It was a battle unlike any other, and it was an exhibition of the trends we'd already seen throughout the battle, that aircraft have primacy over ships, and that long-range gunnery is hard. And I believe that with everything that Kurita had to consider, that he made the right decision. Going into the Gulf would have been pointless, and perhaps we can talk more about that later, but there were, in fact, he was right. There were essentially empty transports inside the Gulf. So that's not, given that, then this notion that the Japanese lost a victory at the Battle of Leyte Gulf is just incorrect. All right, that's it for Leyte Gulf in 20 minutes.
Perfect. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. If I can get the first slide up.
I'll start you.
Let's back up a bit, because that's not it. There we go. All right. I'm here this morning to give you a crash course in the kamikaze phenomenon.
Tip your waitress, folks. We'll be here all week.
Can't believe I really did that. It just came to me this morning. In any case, what I want to look at today is where did the kamikaze phenomenon come from? What's the genesis of that? I want to walk through its early operations in the Philippines as part of the Show 1 plan that Mark has just talked about, and then move on to Okinawa, which is sort of the apotheosis of the whole kamikaze phenomenon, and then dip briefly into an evaluation of the effectiveness of this, both at the tactical and the strategic level. When I think about the kamikaze, I look at it as a clash between an immovable military culture and an absolutely irresistible threat environment. And those two things coming into contact with each other, how do they interact? And, you know, all World War II militaries come into this conflict with echoes of their prior military cultures, I would argue. But I would also argue that in the case of the modern Japanese military, the impact of hundreds of years of Bushido and samurai warrior codes have had a profound impact that truly shaped them. And my case study in this would be this gentleman, Kusunoki Masashige, who was a brilliant samurai tactician, lived in the 1300s, worked for an idiot of an emperor and got killed for his trouble. And in the final moments, in the stupid battle that his stupid emperor told him to fight against overwhelming odds, just before he is killed, he famously quips to his brother, "Would that I had 7 lives to give for my country," and then he's beheaded. And this guy is held up as the perfect exemplar of what a loyal samurai should be. And this statue, which is super famous, actually sits right across the street from the Imperial Palace in Japan. Every schoolboy in Japan knew this guy. Every schoolboy in Tokyo probably saw this statue. You know, that's a lot of schoolboys. And those schoolboys, as it happens, are also very heavily militarized. That a part of the standard education for all boys during the interwar years, really dating back to the late 1800s, was some sort of paramilitary training that goes on from grade school onward. That's who these young men are. If you look at some of the things that the Emperor Meiji, who is the founder of modern Japan, brings in to sort of craft his military, there are a couple of quotes that we can look at out of the Imperial Rescript for Soldiers and Sailors. This first one, Our relations with you will be most intimate when we rely upon you as our limbs and you look up to us as your head. In other words, I am not paying you to think. I am paying you to carry out orders. Likewise, this very famous line down here, duty is weightier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. And that's a line that we see repeated over and over in many accounts out of the Second World War. Which leads to this picture, which I think is absolutely perfectly emblematic of who these gentlemen were. Here we have 5 naval aviators standing in front of a very modern piece of aviation kit, and they're all wearing samurai swords, right? So you have this melding of old and new. The problem for these gentlemen is that they are operating in a threat environment that no one has ever seen before. And so I just want to walk through that. When Task Force 38 or 58, depending on who's driving it that day, shows up off any given locale in the Japanese Empire, it is bringing with it about 120 vessels, about 1,000 aircraft, flying from maybe a dozen aircraft carriers. The majority of those planes are fighters by this time in the war. And then this fantastic menagerie of defensive gun power, almost 7,000 barrels in this fleet. So if we take a look at the sort of the lethality that this creates, by this time, of course, all of our carriers are flying second-generation aircraft like the Hellcat or the Corsair, all being piloted by very skilled aviators at this point in the war, too. All of those assets are now being centrally controlled in a combat information center on the carriers themselves. So if you take a look at 1942, our combat air patrol would push out intercepts 25, 30 miles, something like that. But by the time you get to the middle of 1944, now we're doing intercepts 50, 60, 70, 80 miles away from the fleet, which means that the Japanese aircraft have got to fly through that gauntlet, over ever longer distances before they're in any position to bring their ordnance to bear against the Americans. Any of the leakers that manage to get through this, and there aren't going to be many, are going to be met by copious quantities of the 5-inch 38, which is hands down the best heavy flat gun of the war, and even more barrels of 40-millimeter Bofors, which again is hands down the best light anti-aircraft gun of the war, I would argue. A lot of these assets are now being centrally controlled via radar, which increases their accuracy, of course, and their lethality as well. So one of the ways that you can think about the lethality of a flak environment is to look at the throw weight. How much metal and explosive can we put up in a minute's time? So starting in 1942, about the time of Midway, we've got a nominal American carrier task force here. I got a carrier in the middle, a couple of heavy cruisers, a quartet of destroyers. This formation aggregate can throw up about 32,000 pounds per minute, which I might mention is more than double what a similar Japanese carrier task force would have been able to generate at this point in time. But we're only getting started. By the time you get to 1944, now I'm going to kick out one of those destroyers, replace it with a fast battleship, and I'm also going to add one of our anti-aircraft light cruisers into this mix. Now I'm up to 162,000 pounds per minute, most of it driven by the addition of Bofors and other light automatic weapons. So that's a 5x increase from where we were just 2 years ago, but it's actually worse than that because all of our 5-inch ordnance at this point is using the VT fuse, which has got a little radar transponder in the nose, which means that all I have to do is get that shell basically into the neighborhood of a Japanese airplane, and it will take care of detonating itself. And depending on the studies that you read, that increases the lethality of this shell by between 5 and 7. So if you multiply the throw weight of all of those 5-inch weapons by the lethality of that VT fuse, you're left with this, 575,000 nominal pounds worth of throw weight a minute, okay? So there's a number of implications that come out of that. First, I would argue, with all due respect to the Luftwaffe and flak traps like Bremen and Saint-Nazaire and places like that, that by the time you get to the middle of 1944, the U.S. Navy has created the most lethal anti-aircraft environment on the planet. It's this sort of mobile, 200-mile-wide bubble of doom that wanders around. And if you get anywhere near that bubble of doom, you have essentially signed your own death warrant. which means that conventional naval attacks, naval aviation attacks, are just no longer returning the same bang on the buck as they used to. It doesn't make any sense to spend a year and a half or 2 years training a naval aviator just to throw this guy's life away in the course of a sortie or two. It's asinine. And so the Japanese, by the time of the end of the Battle of Philippine Sea in June of '44, are really left looking around for answers. So let's talk a little bit about the Philippines and what comes about as a result of that. So yes, the Marianas go down. A lot of people in the Japanese Navy are like, now what? Now, how are we going to make lemonade out of the lemons that have been given to us? And sort of organically, there are a number of lower-level commanders that start toying with this notion of what they call sure hit, sure death aerial tactics. In other words, if I have a plane with a bomb on it and I want to put that bomb onto the ship, the best way to amplify the lethality of this weapon is to turn it into a human-guided weapon and increase the accuracy of that bomb, in essence. It's really this guy, though, Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro, who is sort of looked upon as being the father of the kamikaze. And he is the commander-in-chief of the 1st Air Fleet, and his role in the Show 1 plan that Mark has just talked about is he's got to defend the Philippines, and he does not have nearly enough aircraft to do it. And so on the afternoon of 19 October, he walks into the headquarters of the 201st Air Group and starts asking for volunteers for what he calls special attack, to go after the American carrier force and hopefully put it out of business for 1 week, which is ludicrous, but nevertheless, that's what he asks for. And he ends up getting a brace of 24 fairly well-trained aviators, led by a gentleman named Seki. And they carry out their first attacks during the aftermath of the Battle off Samar. And this is the result of the first of those. So this is what happened to the carrier St. Lo after Seki hit it. Her magazines detonate, and down she goes. And the results of these first couple dozen attacks are very, very promising. They sink the St. Lo, they damage 4 other Jeep carriers, and Onishi immediately doubles down and starts turning this into more of an institutionalized phenomenon, I would say. And he says here, these young men, with their limited training, outdated equipment, and numerical inferiority, are doomed even by conventional fighting methods. It is important that their death be not in vain. I honestly think that it is better for all concerned to continue the suicide operations. One might say that actually a more rational approach would be to extricate yourself from the stupid war that you've gotten yourselves into, but nevertheless, that is not what Onishi comes up with. But the bottom line is that the precedent has now been set, and it's pretty clear that this tactic is useful, and so off we go. Between the suicide operations off of Leyte and the subsequent invasion of Luzon, the aggregate results are that they sink a couple of Jeep carriers, a couple of 3 destroyers, and damage another 113 ships. They kill 2,500 American sailors, wound another 3,400. You know, this is a real eye-opener for the Americans at this point, and they have definitely suffered at the hands of the kamikazes. If we take a look then at Okinawa, which is really where things get interesting, if you will. Invasion of Okinawa happens on 1 April 1945, and the Japanese pull out all the stops to try to destroy the American carrier force and also the invasion forces that are off the island itself. And one of the innovations that the Japanese bring to this is what they call kikasui, which are massed kamikaze attacks. They are basically going to swamp our defenses with huge numbers of kamikaze aircraft hitting those defenses all at once. And intriguingly, even given the sort of glacially cold relations between the Army and the Army decides to kick in some of its aircraft into this operation. And so this is one of the first instances where we see joint operations between the 2 Japanese services. So here's a schedule of some of these kikasui attacks. And you can see, you know, the first was by far the biggest, 355 suicide planes thrown into the mix. And I should mention that the advent of kamikaze does not mean the total demise of conventional attacks either. There are a lot of conventional attacks going on in the context of these operations. Among other things, They are escorting, the Japanese are escorting these kamikaze flights with fighter escorts to try to, fight off the American combat air patrol and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of conventional combat going on as well. But the bottom line is, you can see at the bottom of the slide here that the Japanese are going to expend about 1,900 suicide aircraft on this particular battle, broken down, roughly, 55-45 between the Navy and the Army. A lot of those attacks end up going in against the radar pickets that are sort of spread out around the island of Okinawa. In particular, the northern picket stations there, numbers 1, 2, and 3. These are manned by American destroyers and also landing ship gunships that are sort of escorting the destroyers in many cases, but these become very, very dangerous places for American ships to operate. Okinawa is the first time we're going to see the introduction of this weapon, the Oka, which you can think of as honestly sort of a rocket-powered, human-driven fertilizer bomb, in that it's a very high-speed target. It's got about a 2,000-pound warhead in the nose of it. If it hits you, it's really bad news. But the problem for it is that it is carried into battle by by a medium bomber slung underneath the belly of the medium bomber. It's got to get within about a dozen miles or so of an American ship before it is actually dropped and then goes into its final attack. So the Americans very quickly cottoned to the fact that, the easiest way to get rid of an Oka is to shoot down the Betty before it ever gets within range. Bottom line, for the Americans, though, this is an incredibly painful experience. Off Okinawa, we lose 28 ships, including 10 destroyers, another 368 ships damaged to some extent, 5,000 American sailors killed, another 5,000 wounded. This is the bloodiest combat that the U.S. Navy has been in since the terrible battles down around Guadalcanal in 1942. And in the course of this campaign, the Japanese are going to expend 7,830 aircraft between kamikaze attacks, conventional attacks, losses that they suffer on the ground as we are trying to suppress the airfields in places like Kyushu. So this is a really, really bloody battle for both sides. If you take a look at the evaluation of the effectiveness of this, sort of the money quotes are here in red, in that it increases the accuracy of that bomb that's on that airplane really by a factor of 10. Your chance, if you get into attack range with a kamikaze, your chances of hitting a ship are, roughly 1 in 4. That's not bad in an era of dumb iron weapons, right? Furthermore, if you get hit by that kamikaze, it is going to do more damage to you than just being hit by a bomb alone. And that's because you've got the mass of the aircraft, you've got the fuel on that aircraft as well, so it definitely is a nastier thing to be hit by. And it will put you in the yards for longer than just being hit by a dumb bomb. So again, when we look at that roster of damage that was racked up against the Americans, 300-some warships, that's a lot of aggregate yard time that we're going to have to face up to in order to reconstitute a lot of those ships. Nevertheless, okay, great. It's a more effective way of delivering a bomb, super. But an increase in tactical effectiveness doesn't do anything to shift the strategic balance of this particular war. So even despite the expenditure of nearly 8,000 aircraft, it doesn't do anything in terms of overturning our invasion of Okinawa. The problem for the Japanese is that they think they're doing way better than they actually are, that they think this is a much more effective weapon system than it actually is. They claim that they sank 44 of our warships off of Okinawa, and they claim too that many of those were fleet carriers and battleships, whereas the largest ship we actually lost was a destroyer. So that's problem one. And you can see here, if you look in the diary of Admiral Ugaki, he talks about where they sort of going in terms of how do they gauge the lethality of these attacks. And so some of these quotes here, we didn't really know what the results of the attack were, but we heard all these frenzied telephone conversations from the Americans, so it was almost certain that we destroyed 4 carriers. That's not really a quality battle damage assessment, gentlemen. Likewise, the second quote, a reconnaissance plane reported as many 150 columns of black smoke. Yeah, and a lot of those were probably your planes that we had just shot down. Again, You know, if you can't get a plane close enough to the American carriers to actually assess what happened there, you don't really have good information coming out of that engagement. And this kind of results in what I call a delusional feedback loop. You know, we're getting all of this garbage information in that makes us think we're doing better than we are. That leads to the validation of these strategically ineffective tactics, which means that the Japanese then continue doubling down on this hopeless war, and this is going to have really deleterious impacts on our ability to bring this war to a close in the middle of 1945. So, and okay, good. We all have the context here, but understand that there's a very serious phenomenon going on here. Okay, so I picked this slide from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You know, we all know the story, right? Arthur goes into the forest. He wants to cross a bridge. He runs into the Black Knight. The Black Knight says no. They end up fighting. And systematically, Arthur cuts off first his arms and eventually his legs, and the Black Knight will not surrender. And I ask you to contemplate this, that what mechanism does Arthur have to compel the surrender of the Black Knight? He can kill him, that's obvious, but can he make him surrender? And I think the more you ponder that, you have to come to the answer, no. He's got no mechanism to make him actually surrender. It's not until the Black Knight makes the decision that I'm beaten that the war is actually going to be over. And that's the same thing that we find ourselves in the middle of 1945 as a result of this delusional feedback loop. Thank you very much. 19
seconds is there.
I would caution John that using a slide like that is a generational joke. You have to be born at a certain era for it.
Yeah, To understand that context. When I give that slide to high school students, I have to fill them in. Okay,
it means nothing. That's right. That's right. The first question I would like to ask is of Mark, and he talks on his conclusion slide. His very last note was the hint that Kurita threw away his victory, and you make the comment on your slide that that's nonsense. Could you expand on that a little bit more in your conclusion slide, since we were running out of time? But I appreciate if you could. Yeah,
I'd like to. Can we bring up those? I got a couple of slides there that might make this point even easier.
Yeah. You guys bring up Mark's slides, please. Thank you.
So there's the myth that because Kurita turned around to not go into the Gulf, that the Japanese missed this chance to inflict a strategic defeat on the Americans. And I defy you to read a book about Leyte Gulf or a TV show, and even the big museum across the street, they don't say it explicitly, but they edge towards that myth. So, and this myth started right after the war because Samuel Eliot Morison laid it down. And there's three pillars to this myth. The first one was that there's nothing in Kurita's way. He could have waltzed into the Gulf. Mm-hmm. The second part of this myth is that once he got into the Gulf, he'd have no problem destroying all the shipping in the Gulf. And the third part of this myth is that losses of that magnitude would have crippled the American advance. So if we can go to the slide that shows the force balance, because I'm an order of battle guy, so if we can go to the very end there, keep on going, keep on rolling, and we're going to get to the forces that would have been present had there been a battle. One more. There we go. So that's what would have been present on the afternoon of the 25th of October had Kurita attempted to go into the Gulf. So you can see that this nonsense, that there's nothing in his way, has no factual basis. So the 7th Fleet didn't evaporate after it destroyed the Nishimura force in Surigao Strait. It's sitting there on the eastern approaches to Leyte Gulf. Should it be necessary to defend the Gulf against Kurita? So look at the numbers there. Kurita is the one who's outnumbered, not the Americans. The Americans have a large number of Jeep carriers still. Some have just undergone a kamikaze attack. Taffy 3 got beat up in the morning by Kurita, but still, there's hundreds of American aircraft ready to take part in this battle. And it doesn't even include the strongest part of Task Force 38, which is coming up from the south with 5 more carriers. So it looks to me like Kurita would have a hard time getting into the Gulf. Next slide. And next slide. And so had this battle taken place, it wouldn't have gone well for the Japanese. We just saw that the Japanese are outnumbered, they have no air cover, but furthermore, keep in mind that just like Nishimura, when he advanced through Surigao Strait and was ambushed at the head of the strait, the same thing would have applied in the eastern approaches to Leyte Gulf. There are 2 channels into the Gulf from the east, and the Americans were waiting for them in these channels. So it's unlikely, given all these factors we just talked about, the Japanese would have succeeded in penetrating into Leyte Gulf. It's even more unlikely that had they gotten into the Gulf, they would be able to shoot up shipping in the Gulf. The Americans knew there could be an attempt by Kurita to come into the Gulf. They had moved all the shipping to the northern part of the Gulf. I'm sure that what would have happened had there been a battle in Leyte Gulf was a bigger and messier version than the Battle off Samar. You have a lot of smoke hiding the shipping in the northern part of the Gulf. Japanese are under constant air attack once again, constant attack by all the smaller units in the 7th Fleet. So this battle would not have gone well for Kurita. But let's suppose he did get into the Gulf and he was able to shoot up some of the ships there. On the slide, we see what was present there on the 25th of October. This is not the invasion force. These are not loaded like troops, loaded with troops. This is the 2nd supply echelon. So these are, like Kurita feared, they're essentially empty transports. 23 LSTs were there, 28 Liberty ships. Well, during the war, the Americans produced 1,100 LSTs and 2,700 Liberty ships. So had Kurita been able to shoot up some number of these ships, yes, it would have been a speed bump for the Americans, but there is no way this would have constituted a major setback for the Americans. So next time you see this in one of these books or TV shows, you'll know the real story behind the unfought Battle of Leyte Gulf.
Nice.
Great. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. John, I have a question for you. When we talk about the kamikazes, we always focus on the aerial component.
Right.
And I'm sure you will know there's more than just an aerial. There's a subsurface and a subsurface component to these attacks that are not as well publicized. Could you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, by the time you get to the end of the war, and certainly to the time of Okinawa, I think you can say that Japan's whole military strategy is kind of morphed into orienting itself around suicide attacks. And so, yes, we have kamikaze aircraft, but we also have kamikaze submarines in many cases. They've developed a thing called a kaiten, which is basically a long-lance torpedo. You rip out this middle section, put a human being in there, and now you've got a human-powered torpedo. Super. They've got kamikaze speedboats. They are developing techniques for using frogmen, fukuryu they call them, undersea dragons that are frogmen that are supposed to have a limpet mine on the top of a bamboo pole. I'm going to be waiting underneath the water for a landing craft to go past over my head, and I yoink this thing into the bottom of the landing craft, and it's going to blow me and the landing craft up. And if you actually do the physics of how long it takes a landing craft to go over your head, there's no possible way they would have been able to hit it, but nevertheless. The bottom line is that when we take the surrender of Japan and go into some of their shipyards, there are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these suicide submarines and torpedoes that are under construction, and suicide bombs, suicide aircraft, suicide speedboats, suicide everything. Yeah, it's a whole panoply of weapons.
If I can, and go back to the graphics about the American fleet's centralized control and the bubble of doom, I think is how you refer to it.
Bubble of doom,
yeah. I'd like to compare and contrast that, say, with a Japanese naval aerial flotilla in terms of centralized control and anti-aircraft defense. Can you compare and contrast?
Yeah, actually, and that's one of the sort of interesting things I'm a technologist by training, and I spent 30 years in IT, and there's a tendency on the part of a lot of people to say, well, if you've got radar, then you get all these other goodies too, and that's not true. That radar alone, the raw technology, is useful, but it's really the maturation of the management techniques and other doctrine that goes around that leads to something like the Combat Information Center, where I'm coalescing not only all of these radar inputs, but all the radio inputs from my aircraft aloft and that sort of thing, so that I can plot the incoming raids and vector fighters out to them. If you look at what the Japanese do, yes, they start putting radar on their ships. They're a little late to the game. But they never sort of made the conceptual leap to the Combat Information Center, even as late as the Battle of Philippine Sea. And Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're using their radar as raid warning, but they're not really doing much in the way of actually vectoring fighters onto targets.
If so, it's at a very short range.
Right. Yeah.
And so you're looking at a standpoint of managing your defensive
Battle
aerial
management.
fleet. Vector you over here, just like the Brits did in the Battle of Britain, they could
Correct.
vector with Shane home. The Japanese never embraced that as a management of their aerial assets.
There is some evidence that they started putting CICs into some of their cruisers later on in the war for usage in night battle. But of course, by that time in the war, the whole night battle phase has kind of come and gone. So yeah, they were very late to the party in that respect.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I thought I read a quote somewhere where they asked a Japanese officer very early in the war, even during the interwar years, about radar. And he says, "Why do I need that? I have eyes." And so they kind of...
Well, and arguably too, if you take a look at some of those early war battles off of Guadalcanal, in many cases their lookouts were better than our radar. That was certainly true then. But
Especially for night fighting.
Yeah.
Certainly at night.
yeah,
Than our early radar, which was
Right.
not so hot, right?
yeah, but that ain't true anymore in 1944. That's for sure.
Hey, Mark, I'd like to expand a little bit. You criticized Toyota for going with a bad plan. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, it was a bad plan to be sure, as I tried to hammer home. But so it's fair to say, though, that he didn't have any good options in October 1944. That's very true. But it's also true to say that he had some less bad options than the ones he used. So Show 1 was a reckless plan. I think we've seen that. It was essentially a mass special attack operation. So what he should have done, I believe, is defer his decisive battle. The Imperial Army wanted to fight the battle for the Philippines on Luzon, not on Leyte. And I think that that Toyota read the battle wrong. If the Americans get airfields on Leyte, that doesn't really cut down the slocks between Japan and the Southern Resource Areas. If you get airfields on Luzon, that's a different story. So the Japanese could have held the fleet in reserve, rebuild the air strength, land-based, and also they had hoped to rebuild their carrier force by December, and then they could have reconcentrated their fleet again and given the Curatola force some air cover. And John talked about the kamikaze attacks, which began in dribs and drabs in October. Well, just think if they had been smart enough to build a huge suicide force and use that en masse, like in January, when the Americans tried to invade Luzon, that would have been a tremendous shock to the system.
Yeah.
So they could have dragged out the battle for Luzon for months, much more than they did, instead of going down in a brief blaze of glory off Leyte. So a desperate plan is really not a good basis for victory.
John, if I can shift to more of a cultural question, can you talk about the makeup of these men? Where they come from, their backgrounds, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and this is one of the kind of interesting aspects when we take our tour over to Japan. We go to two separate kamikaze bases, both Army bases, Chiron and the Bansei, down near Kagoshima. And they have exhibits, obviously, to these young men, some of whom are, as young as 17. A lot of these guys were pretty well educated, and a lot of them were college students who had, deferred enlistment in the forces until later on in the war. And so this is a very literate group of young men. In many cases, you can see the exhibits on some of their final letters and poems that they write home to their parents or wives or what have you, and they're extremely poignant. So, and this is one of the reasons for the sort of the contrasting imagery that we see between the Americans and the Japanese. We don't know who this guy is who's diving into our ship. You know, from the American standpoint, the images that we predominantly have are ones of futility as we shoot them down before they get to us, and death and mayhem when they do hit us and, you know, lay our guys out in windrows. The Japanese imagery is all of these, you know, valiant young men, maybe in a bad cause, but they are giving their lives nobly for their country. We see these famous images, of course, of young schoolgirls who were lined up, you know, along the runways as they're taking off. So there's a real contrast here in terms of how they perceive this whole phenomenon and how we do.
Great, thank you. At this time, I'd like to open the floor up. Some questions from the audience. Jeremy, take it away.
Yeah, a round of applause for the panel, please. We're going to go halfway back to your right, please.
This is a question for John. Could you speak to the evolution of the Americans' tactics for dealing with the kamikaze, you know, from Leyte through the weeks and weeks of Okinawa?
Yeah, great question. And I'll ask Mark to pipe in here too if he wants to. Yeah, when this first starts happening to us in the Philippines, again, it's a real eye-opener. And one of the things that we trot out as a reaction to that is what we call the big blue blanket. That, okay, we know we're really good at air defense at range. What we're going to do now, though, is we're going to extend that air blanket even further to the point where the goal now becomes suppressing all of the air bases that the kamikaze attacks may emanate from. And so we're putting standing combat air patrols over a lot of these bases and just making it impossible for the Japanese to even get up in the air. That becomes a lot more difficult, though, when you roll forward to Okinawa. Now you're trying to suppress all of Kyushu and also bases on Formosa as well. So there's a kind of a constant back and forth here. And if you fast forward to what would it have been like to operate off the coast of Japan itself in the face of a kamikaze threat, particularly because by then the Japanese have morphed their own doctrine away from trying to launch attacks against our carriers and more towards, now we're going to go after the invasion transports. That, I think, creates a threat environment for us that would have been extremely difficult to operate in because these Japanese aircraft are dispersed. In many cases, they're sitting in caves. They're going to be using side roads to take off from. I can fly over land for the majority of my ingress towards the target, and then I can pop out over the water. I've only got a couple miles to go. There's my big juicy transport there, and it's big and slow and doesn't have nearly the firepower that something like an American destroyer has. That could have been a really, really bad environment for us. Any additional?
The Americans kept on trying to increase their warning time. So John mentioned the picket destroyers. That's one attempt to do that. But also later in the campaign and for the invasion of Japan, they're planning on using picket submarines to pick up air raids and also long-range aircraft to provide even more warning on these approaching raids. But it would have been a bloodbath had kamikazes been used in those huge numbers for the invasion of Japan.
Yeah, for sure.
Going to stay with me to your right.
Most of the sources I've read don't discuss the additional severe command and control problems that Admiral Kurita had. His original command ship was a heavy cruiser that was sunk out from underneath him in the Sibuyan Sea, and I've heard descriptions he had to swim for his life. But more significantly, when he went to the battleship Yamato, he had lost most of his signal staff. So he's exhausted. He's operating on a battleship that has never been designed to command a whole fleet with a group of strangers and probably a lot of jealousy from the, commanding admiral. So I'm just wondering if you could, elaborate on some of those additional disadvantages.
He had a tough few days there. Like you said, the battle started out on the 23rd when he's his heavy cruiser was torpedoed in the Palawan Passage by an American sub, so he did take a little swim early in the morning. Then he gets on board battleship Yamato, which did have a good communications suite, but like you said, he lost a lot of his staff. But in general, though, it just wasn't a problem with Kurita and his force. It was a system-wide problem with the Imperial Navy at that point in the war. Communications were bad. The friction of war is real. And he literally, like the Battle of Samar, he did not know what was going on beyond what he could see off the bridge of Yamato. So it was a huge factor in the battle, as we talked about.
Yeah, I too was going to push back on the notion that Yamato did not have sufficient staff spaces. I mean, she was designed as a fleet command asset, so she certainly had the communication suite and the place to put staff officers if you wanted to do that. But you're quite right that Kurita had gone in the drink and had lost a lot of his people too.
Next question is going to be with Connie to your left, towards the back, please.
Thank you so much for an interesting presentation. Clearly the kamikaze, when their sacrifice was met with great honor and glory, what compensation was made to their families in exchange for their service?
Wow. I don't know the answer to the question right off the top of my head. And of course, a lot of those benefits end up going away, though, after the war.
The families are certainly exalted.
Yeah.
You know, they're held in great esteem by their neighbors
Yes.
and
I mean,
communities.
you do see, like, Lieutenant Secchi, for instance, I think is advanced in rank as a result of his actions, and therefore he would get higher pay in pension to any survivors he had, and he did have a wife. But I'm not sure from sort of an aggregate perspective exactly what happened to all of their aviators. If there was some sort of uniform policy that was applied, I just don't know the answer to that. That's a great question, though.
Next question is going to be in the front to your left.
Excellent presentation, as always. John, a question for you. What impact, if any, did the kamikaze attacks off Okinawa have on how the land battle ensued in the relationship between Spruance and Simon Bolivar Buckner?
I think that there is clearly some impatience on the part of both Spruance and Nimitz that, guys, we need you to wrap this thing up on Okinawa as rapidly as possible because we're just getting absolutely beaten out here. And one of the, fundamental defensive attributes that our carrier force has is it can kind of hit and run. And as long as this battle is dragging on, our carriers, in essence, are tethered to operating somewhere off of Okinawa. And that is making life difficult for us. We don't have the ability to use their strategic mobility to get away from this. So that's my sense, that there's this underlying frustration with Buckner's rather methodical advance on that island, and they wish that he could get it over with sooner. Do you have any?
Yeah, I
you're my
echo your
Marine.
sentiment
Hit
on
me,
that.
man.
Hurry up and get this thing over with because we are taking a beating out here. So for both the Marines and the Army ashore, hurry up, take Sherry Castle, get down to Naha, wrap this thing up.
Yeah.
We're going to go to the two here to your left.
After Okinawa is finally conquered, what with the land-based air power that gets moved in, obviously the 8th's planning on coming from Europe, how much would that have been able to help suppress the kamikazes on the mainland? Because now you've got more mass. I mean,
Right.
the fleet can pull back, relax, like we've discussed, they're kind of worn out at this point, but now you got land-based where the sorting factors massively increase. I mean, when these air assets are in place prior to November, what do we think it's going to be in terms of suppressing it, making it less of a problem?
First of all, I'll just say that my crystal ball is not big enough to come up with a definitive answer. And actually, Mr. John Greco would probably be a better guy to ask that question. But I think you're absolutely right that with additional land-based assets on Okinawa, we're going to be flying every Mustang and in God's creation over Kyushu to try to suppress all of those airfields. On the other hand, the Japanese have made some pretty strenuous efforts to disperse those assets and use, diversionary fields to take off from and so forth. I'm a little skeptical of our ability in the days before real AWACS to be able to really shut down the entire southern part of Kyushu and make it impossible for them to operate aircraft in that environment. I think there's always going to be some leakers. Sure. And given the fact that we're going to be operating so close offshore, I think we're still going to be punished as a result.
Mark?
I'm wide open to countervailing.
If I may
Please.
jump on that, and again, I think Mr. Jen Greco or Rich Frank probably has better insights, but by this time, late in the war, the Navy is actually having, air control afloat to manage not just naval assets, but also U.S. Army Air Force's assets within an amphibious objective area. And they're talking to these control ships that are sitting out these LSTs that have radars on them. And so even in an amphibious environment, U.S. Marine Corps, you're welcome, that there's a command and control effort being made in these littorals to command both naval and ground-based air. So I agree with you, you're still going to get leakers through, but we are working on this joint air management already. And Mark, any insights on that?
Right, and that's where these airborne early warning platforms come into play, which they would have had deployed by the invasion of Japan.
That's right.
You kind of touched on it a little bit, John, but what did the Japanese Army do? Like, I know they had hand in like the Shinho and the Heiho speedboat tactics. Did they have any effect on trying to come up with a special attack group for ground-based combat, or was this mainly just a Navy idea for kamikazes?
I think the genesis of the concept is clearly in the Japanese Navy, and it's really only when you get to Okinawa that the Army, I think there's a certain element of shame in this, that, okay, the Navy is expending their aircraft in these methods, we should probably start chipping in too. Although, if you go back to even some of the carrier battles off of Formosa, you did see instances where the Army was kicking in two-engine medium bombers armed with torpedoes, and they were operating jointly with the Navy in that respect as well. So I don't want to say that it is the advent of the kamikaze that results in joint operations between the Imperial Army and Navy. It really has precedent a little earlier in the year, but it's also clear, I think, that just the pressure of knowing that the Navy is going to be expending huge numbers of aircraft in this fashion then drives the Army into coming into cahoots and saying, yeah, okay, we'll carve out a chunk of our planes to operate in that fashion as well.
And there was a case, too, when the Army used their suicide boat brigades in the invasion of Manila Bay in January 1945. So they had some numbers, I can't pull it off the top of my head, but there were something like 90 different speedboats, and they were launched at close range against an American invasion force in Manila Bay, and they had minimal effect. It was a night attack, but still, it didn't work that well. They had a few ships, but overall, it was ineffective.
Last question is going to be with Connie, all the way in the back to your right, please.
Thank you. My question is, when did they send up American fighters to engage the Japanese fighters that were coming in, and when did they break off from them with all this anti-aircraft fire that was coming in?
It depended on an engagement by engagement basis. How long can their even conventional fighters operate in that threat space? It all depended. In a lot of cases, those guys would try to ride herd over the kamikazes, as long as they could, but eventually they're going to be driven off. And as you can see from some of the quotes that we have from Ugaki, in a lot of cases, they never even get within eyesight of the American fleet before they are forced to break off to preserve their own skins. Any further?
But there were free fire zones where the American fighters really weren't supposed to enter, that the AA was the primary vehicle to defeat the kamikaze. But of course, a good fighter probably isn't going to listen to that, and he's going to pursue the target into that free fire zone. But they were supposed to be, to eliminate blue on blue. That's how they tried to work engagements.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Curatola, Mark Stille, and John Parshall.
Well done.
All right.
Well done, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have our first break for the day. The three authors will be outside to sign their books. Please be back for 10:45 and our next session, the return to the Philippines.